Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Bitcoin, and we're going to be providing an update to the bull market support band. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and check out Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Let's go ahead and jump in. So, we had another interesting weekly close by Bitcoin. It was a good weekly close where Bitcoin was able to close above its 20-week moving average and, of course, its 21-week EMA. But right now, the 20-week SMA is still above the 21-week EMA, although that could change relatively soon if the price continues to pick up here. One of the things I said, and I've said this many, many times over the years, is that when you get weekly candles up here and you get wicks below it, the wicks don't matter, right? They just don't. What matters is, are the bulls able to close above the level before the weekly close is over? And if they are, then that would still be interpreted as a bullish sign going into the following week, right? It doesn't matter if it came all the way down here. And what I said, right, was that if Bitcoin can hold this level, then it would favor a rally back up to, at least 66K. And frankly, I mean, it could certainly go higher, right? I mean, and if it's going to go back up to this trend line, then it would make sense for it to even go higher, right, than 66K. Now, ultimately, the question that we want to think about, I think, in this video is not whether Bitcoin can go to 68K or not, right? I mean, by the time I publish the video, there's a chance that Bitcoin could be at 68K, right? That's not as important, I think, to a lot of the viewers of this channel. One of the things I have said for a long time is just that I'm keeping my portfolio Bitcoin, my crypto portfolio Bitcoin heavy until Bitcoin dominance reaches 60%. Now, it's been taking a long time for dominance to theoretically reach 60%, but it continues to be a worthwhile strategy, right? Bitcoin heavy until dominance is at 60%. Now, the reason why that's great is because it helps you maintain exposure to potential upside while minimizing your downside risk. But what's interesting here is that Bitcoin has rallied back up to basically the same spot that it rallied to in late September. So I do want to talk about a potential path as well. I think the path is always going to be very difficult to nail down. And frankly, there's no guarantee that Bitcoin even goes back up to the trend line, right? But let's suppose that it does. And you could find plenty of reasons for why it might go back up to this trend line, right? I mean, plenty of reasons, one of which is that, well, typically speaking, if you were to look at monthly returns for Bitcoin in October, it tends to be a green month, right? I mean, it not always, right? Just like, most of the time September is a red month, but sometimes it's green. Sometimes October is red, but usually it's green. So far this month, Bitcoin is up approximately 4%. So one reason why it might do that is because October does tend to be a good month. One thing to note, one caveat is in 2012, Bitcoin actually closed the month down 10%, which was also a halving year, although it did go on to be positive in November and December of that year. The other thing to think about is when you look at the ROI from the low for Bitcoin, as I've been mentioning in many videos recently, this is around the time that you would expect Bitcoin to move up based on the last couple of cycles, right? So as long as there's no, outside thing that's affecting the market, because again, markets generally trend higher, they need a reason to go down, not a reason to go up, at least for, decent assets. Of course, you can find random altcoins that have no business existing and they'll go down no matter what. But for hard assets, for good assets that actually have value, they don't really need a reason to go up. They need a reason to go down. And so if Bitcoin continues to sort of follow that view of ROI from the low and monthly returns in October, then it could certainly favor reaching this trend line. It doesn't have to reach it immediately, though. And in fact, last month, there was a rally from basically this same level up to around 66K before selling back off. So one thing I wanted to talk about is and also, by the way, over here, right, there was a rally up to around 66K, and then it came back down to 63K, right, which this time would correspond to back testing that, right, if it back tests sort of this little resistance that it got right there, if it came back down and back tested it, and then maybe it goes up after that. You can kind of see a similar type of move here, right? 1, 2, and then 3. And it got up here at the end of the month, right? At the end of the month. And when it first made this move, it was around the middle of the month, right? Which is where we are right now, the middle of October. So that is going to be an interesting path to follow. Like, does it do something like this where it comes back down and then rallies up again and then back down and then rallies up again by the end of the month? And then the question, of course, is, can it actually surpass the lower high structure? I mean, as I've said, no one watching this video should really care whether Bitcoin is at 66K or 68K or 64K, right? It's all, it's all basically the same thing, right? There's not a huge difference. I think what people are more so interested in is, what is the next big move by Bitcoin, right? What comes first? 80K or 40K, right? What comes first there? Not, is it 68K or 63K? Who cares, right? Who cares? I think would probably be the appropriate response. But when I look at a chart like this on the weekly time frame, what I would say is, look, in the short term, you've had Bitcoin go down here, rally back up, hold the bull market support band as support, and then it's starting to pick up steam again, right? That's what it looks like on the weekly time frame. Who cares about what happens tomorrow, right? And so that is what I would prefer to focus on. Now, one of the things we've talked about before is this comparison to 2019. And we've talked about it a few times, right? And how after about 6 to 7 months, right, it took 7 months over here to break through the lower high structure, or at least to come back up to it after sort of a long period of not reaching it. It took about 7 months. Well, it's been about 7 months, right? This was March to October. So it's been about that 7-month time frame. So it would make sense, right, for Bitcoin to potentially reach it at the very least, right? That doesn't mean that it has to break through. We'll talk about that in a minute. But it would make sense that it, could at least reach this level and test it as support. And what is that level exactly? Well, I mean, it kind of depends on how you connect the dots, right, on your candles here. And we'll do it a couple of ways just so we're covering our bases. But if you connect it, like if you connect the highest points, right, this one to that one, then this would actually put you up at around 69K, right, around 69K. If instead you connect it like this, where you're more so connecting this point to that one, to that one, to that one, and that's just sort of a wick above it, then that would correspond a little bit lower to, say, 68K. That's going to be an important resistance level for Bitcoin. Now, why, since March, has Bitcoin been putting in lower highs when the S&P just keeps going higher? One of the things about the S&P that I think everyone should remember is that it does tend to trend up, right? And yes, there will be bear markets, and yes, there will even be recessions, and yes, there's going to be crashes, and if you're an investor, you got to accept that risk. And this is why I say for things like the S&P, I think you're much better off just coming up with a DCA strategy and sticking with that rather than trying to time the market. There is a reason that most hedge funds underperform the S&P, right? And frankly, I don't understand why a lot of people assume that they can do any better than the S&P 500. And I can assure you, when it comes to the stock market, I think the S&P 500, it's really hard to beat. And so if if it is really hard to beat, why fight it, right? Why try to time things, in certain ways, right? Why try to fight it? Yes, there's going to be drops, right? Everyone accepts that. But this is why I say, right, it's better for the S&P to just come up with a DCA strategy based on maybe a risk level or whatever and stick with that and tune out everything else, because the market can go up for far longer than I think anyone thinks it can. And then when it does drop, it can drop far quicker than anyone thinks it can. But if history has taught you anything over the last few years, it's that predicting those moves is extremely difficult, right? You know, the big drops, it's extremely difficult. So why though, right? Why since March, right? If you look at it since March, the S&P has been putting in higher highs. So why is the S&P able to put in higher highs while Bitcoin's putting in lower highs? Well, the reason, and again, a lot of people don't necessarily want to hear this, but the reason is because Bitcoin is further up the risk curve than the S&P, right? It just is. That doesn't mean it'll always be that way, but it is further up the risk curve. The other thing to consider is that Bitcoin also went up a lot more than the S&P 500, right, by March, right? I mean, if you measure from the low, you know, from October 2022 to March, the S&P had gone up 50%. But if you look at Bitcoin from its low, right? If you look at it, Bitcoin from its low to March, it had gone up 370%. So, you know, if you had just stuck with Bitcoin, you would have still outperformed the S&P 500 as measured from the low. But that's also not like the fairest of comparisons either, because someone could say, well, why do you measure it? You know, why cherry pick the bottom, right? Why not measure it from the 2021 high, right? If you measure from the 2021 high, by March of 2024, Bitcoin was up 7%. If you measure it for the S&P, by March, it was up 9% from the high. So it's easy for people to cherry pick whatever they want to tell the narrative that they want to tell. We're all guilty of it, including me, right? If you measure things from a cherry-picked low, you can easily show why that thing that you are cherry-picking outperforms other things that you're not measuring from a similar reference point, you know, where it bled down the same amount. But you can easily find scenarios where your cherry-picked narrative does not always hold up under scrutiny. Okay? So why has the S&P trended higher while Bitcoin has trended lower? Well, the same thing happened last cycle, right? And this is what I wanted to stress this year, is that this might repeat itself. And it has, although it's not been as bad as what we saw back over here in 2019. But what specifically? You know, because one of the things that I think a lot more people are following now is the labor market, right? The unemployment rate. What's interesting is that the unemployment rate, when it started to really increase, if you guys remember where it started to basically go up every single month, right? It was like 0.1, 0.1, 0.1, 0.2. If you look at this, when Bitcoin topped in March, look to see what the unemployment rate was doing. That is exactly when the unemployment rate started to go up more aggressively. So Bitcoin saw this, right? It saw this and respected it because Bitcoin's further up the risk curve than the S&P, right? Bitcoin isn't going to play the same game. It's going to look at that and say, you know what? You know, Bitcoin's sort of closer to I think like liquidity. I mean, it's not as dependent on passive flows from 401ks, obviously, as the S&P is. So it's looking at this thinking, you know what? Does this present a problem or not? And because it had gone up so much more, I think you could argue this became a bit more concerning for Bitcoin than it did the S&P 500. Now, over the last couple of months, the unemployment rate has been going back down. And while the unemployment rate has been going back down, Bitcoin has started picking back up. You see that? So what I think, and I've been saying this in a lot of videos recently, what I think is there are two primary paths to consider here, right? And unfortunately, no one has a crystal ball. I could certainly come up with a lot of evidence to support either view, right? But I would say this. If the unemployment rate keeps trending down, then it's more likely than not that Bitcoin just breaks through the lower high structure, right? If this lower high structure, you know, where it sort of comes into play here at 68, 69K, depending on how you measure it, if the unemployment rate, you know, comes in low and it drops again in November, I think it would favor Bitcoin breaking through. But if the unemployment rate shoots back up, then it would probably favor Bitcoin getting rejected again. One of the interesting things about all of these major rejections by Bitcoin is that they've all occurred around the beginning of the month when the labor market data comes in, right? Look at this. So this rejection here, before we came all the way down here, occurred in early April. This rejection here, early June. This rejection here, late July, early August. I mean, it was the week starting July 29th, but obviously that week went into early August. So every rejection by Bitcoin at this trend line up here corresponded to an unemployment rate that was going up. You see that? Every single one. And now with the unemployment rate going down, it makes sense that Bitcoin is rallying back into that trend line, because not only do you have favorable seasonality, but you also look at the unemployment and you're like, hell, it's back down to 4.1%. The last time unemployment rate was at 4.1, back over here, Bitcoin was at, 69, 70K. So why can't it test it again, right? And this is why a month or two ago, I said that the 2019 pattern had completed, right? You had your lows, right? You had all of your lows that you needed to say the 2019 pattern was complete. You had 6 months of lower highs and lower lows, right? 6 months of it. And therefore, it would make sense for Bitcoin to rally back up and test this at least one more time. The question is, can it break through? Again, I think the answer is going to lie in something we don't actually have the answer to yet. And it's going to be in terms of, where does the unemployment rate go next month in November? One of the interesting things about Bitcoin is if you look at year-to-date ROI of it, every single Q4 of having years, it's gone up, right? I mean, every single one, it's gone up in Q4. So to bet against that would certainly be betting against seasonality. And therefore, it's probably not wise to put all your chips in betting against that. With that said, there's some evidence to suggest that there's going to be at least some concerns related to the labor market before the year is over. One of those is the fact that we still have not yet had the uninversion of the 2-month and the 10-year yield. And if you actually look at Treasury yield spreads, it was actually the uninversion process of the 2-year and the 10-year. It was the uninversion process of the 2-year and the 10-year, which corresponded to the drop that Bitcoin had back in August, right? If you look when the uninversion process occurred between the 2-year and the 10-year, right, it was going on in like August, September, and that is when Bitcoin had this big drop down here, right, in August during the uninversion process. Now, the only other major thing to look at, I think, as far as the yield curve is concerned in the short term, is the uninversion process of the 3-month and the 10-year yield. And if you go back to the 2-year and the 10-year yield, it took about 25 to 26 months, right? Because it inverted in July of 2022 and uninverted in August, September of 2024. If you look at the 3-month and the 10-year yield, it inverted in October of 2022. So 25 to 26 months later would put you in November/December of 2024. So if there is an unemployment rate print that is bad in either November or December, then that could make Bitcoin go against the grain from what it normally does, right? Now, for me as an investor, I can't know the answer. So I just try to prepare for the outcomes and say, look, the way that I've done it for the last 3 years is I've just kept my portfolio Bitcoin heavy until Bitcoin dominance is at 60%. I've told you guys for a long time that Bitcoin dominance will likely top while Bitcoin is above its 20-week SMA. And every time it goes below it, I get a lot of comments from people saying, well, why do you think Bitcoin dominance is going to keep going higher? It's below the 20-week. But look, it's all just been sort of a wash because it keeps bouncing right back above the bull market support band. And every single time it does, more or less, we just find the Bitcoin dominance at a higher level. And what I have said before is that there could be one final drop by Bitcoin after dominance hits 60%, after it tops out. Last cycle, dominance topped out right here. And then following that top, Bitcoin dropped to the 100-week moving average, right? And right now, you have this 100-week moving average sort of coming up to that point right there in November, December timeframe. So I would say if the unemployment rate weakness is over with, right? If there's no more higher unemployment rate prints, then it would favor Bitcoin breaking out and then maybe back testing it and then going up. If the unemployment rate weakness is a thing of the past and we don't have to worry about it anymore. If, on the other hand, if it's not behind us, and let's say, come November, we get something like what happened in 1957, where the unemployment rate, spiked from 3.7 to 4.3% over several months. After hitting 4.3, it dropped to 4.1 over 2 months, and then the next month it dropped to 4. It went up to 4.4. If something like that happens, where it just goes right back up, that I think would be a reason why Bitcoin could get rejected off of the top of that trend line again. And interestingly enough, if it did get another drop later on, then of course the 2019 comparisons played out, right? That's played out, and all year long people were like, well, what about this, right? What about that? That's the landing, right? That's the hard landing. But look, guys, first of all, there's no guarantee we get a hard landing. Second of all, even if we do get a hard landing, it might not happen until 2026. If Bitcoin were to come down here, that's not a hard landing, that's a soft landing. Right? A hard landing is way back over here, which I don't think anyone wants, right? A soft landing is more so the 100-week SMA. One interesting thing about Bitcoin is I feel like we can learn a lot about it through looking through the lens of other cryptocurrencies. And one of the things about Ethereum that I keep looking at is what happened in 2016, where it dropped in April, it dropped in August, and then the final low by ETH was in December. And then this year, 2024, it dropped in April and then in August. And I'm like, does that mean that the final low is going to be in December? Where if you connect the dots, that tells you where it bottoms. Right? I mean, is that what's happening here? The thing is back over here in 2016, while ETH was putting in lower lows, Bitcoin was putting in higher lows in 2016. Right? You have April, August, and December. But this year, Bitcoin has not been putting in higher lows. It's been putting in lower lows, right? So it's the drop by ETH has been accompanied by a drop by Bitcoin. You got April, August. So if the unemployment rate comes in hot, meaning it comes in way higher than people think, then Bitcoin is more likely to get rejected from this. If it comes in low at like 3.9, 4%, hell, even staying at 4.1 might be enough, then it could break through, right? Because, the market's not going to wait forever for the labor market to fall apart. It needs a reason not to go up, right? It needs a reason to go down, not a reason to go up. So that's what I would look at. Now, look, if there is a drop in Q4 later on, right, November, December, then I think it might be, a lot of people might not like that, and it might scare a lot of people. But there is a reality that, you could have something like that happen and the market cycle still be perfectly intact, even though it might not seem like it, right? Because again, that's what happened in 2019. The market dropped, and then a year later, after that drop, after this scary drop, it then topped a year after that. What's interesting about this, if we fast forward in our minds, when does Bitcoin normally top? Does it normally top in halving years? Or does it normally top in post-halving years? Normally it tops in post-halving years. So there's a lot of discussion also about a left translated cycle, which is not my base case, right? And I've made that clear. But if there is a drop later in Q4 because of a bad unemployment rate, and you think about it, if that's December, a year after December 2024 is December 2025, which is normally when Bitcoin tops, right? December or November of the post-halving year. So you have to wonder, could that set up in the same way, right? Where you get a scary drop and then it just rallies up in 2025 just like it always does. So I would watch that certainly. Look, in the short term though, I think you're going to see Bitcoin spend some time up here because the only times it's gotten really rejected is after these bad labor market prints. And that's still a couple of weeks away. I mean, that's still at least 2 weeks away from now. Right? 2 weeks from today is October 28th. That will be the week where we get the unemployment rate print because that Friday will correspond to the first Friday of November. So we will get an unemployment rate print before the election and before the next FOMC. So whatever happens at that unemployment rate print will dictate what happens here by Bitcoin. And no one has the answer. No one has the answer. It is easy to find evidence to support either view. Easy. And take it from me, I spend an unhealthy amount of time looking at this stuff. October seasonality favors the bullish view. Year-to-date ROI favors the bullish view. Market cycle ROI favors the bullish view. And halving year ROI favors the bullish view. The bearish view is only really favored if the unemployment rate goes up. Because if it doesn't go up, then it doesn't really favor it. But I've said before, right? I mean, it's the labor market that Bitcoin will be concerned about. And that's what Bitcoin has been concerned about since March, is the labor market. Why else would Bitcoin be putting in lower highs since March, while a lot of other things and other asset classes just keep going higher? That's what happened last cycle. I mean, the cycle is very similar, actually. So what I think are the two most likely outcomes, right, are for Bitcoin to chop around here for a little bit longer. By the end of the month, right, or at least before the end of the month, at some point, I could see it up here and then waiting until that next print to come through, right? That next print to come through. If it's a bad print, I think it's just going to get rejected again and then go down. If it's a good print, I think it'll break through and go up. I keep my crypto portfolio Bitcoin heavy either way. I don't really care. But I gotta say, guys, it's been an easy ride for a long time because it was always, as long as Bitcoin dominance is not at 60% yet, I will stay Bitcoin heavy. And I've said this is the easiest part of the cycle, right? You just ride Bitcoin until the dominance is at a much higher level. But now we're getting close, right? I mean, like there's no denying that dominance is getting closer and closer to 60%, exactly when it should be. Last cycle, dominance did not top until, the very end of the halving year, or the early part of right here, right? The last part of the halving year is when Bitcoin dominance topped. What if it just does the same thing here, going into the end of the year? And then in 2025, Bitcoin dominance goes down. I could see that playing out, And I mean, if I'm being honest, right? This scenario here, breaking out, coming back down and back testing it and going up, I could see that happening if the labor market weakness is behind us. But if I'm also being honest, if the unemployment rate keeps going up, which seems like there's a good case that it easily could, right? If you go look at initial claims. If you look at initial claims, they've been spiking up recently. And yes, you could partially blame it on Hurricane Helene in North Carolina, but there were some other states where it's also kind of looking like initial claims are picking up, like in Michigan and in Washington and in Oregon. And normally, it's as you get into the November, December is where initial claims normalized by population have really picked up. Look at October of 2022. It looked like that. Not so bad. But then look what it looked like by December. Whew. Of 2022. You see that? October was not that bad. But by December, it looked pretty bad. And then October 2023, it looked like that. Not so bad. But by December 2023, initial claims were picking up again, right? And then you look at October 2024, and it's already looking worse than October of some of these other years, right? And in both of those years, by December, they looked a lot worse. So it's already looking like this, and it's not even November, December yet. So if the initial claims continue this, right, and they very well could, because we just had Hurricane Milton hit Florida. So if initial claims continue to go up for a few more weeks, then that might imply the unemployment rate would follow. If you actually look at unemployment rate versus claims, right, if you overlay the unemployment rate with claims, initial claims, you can see that they tend to track each other, right? So if initial claims are going up, right, you can see that initial claims topped here in July, they came down, but then they're going back up again, implying that the unemployment rate could very well start going back up again, just like it did in 1957, where it went from 4.3 to 4.1 and then went right back up to 4.4 the following month. So we got to watch this like a hawk, I think, because I know, and I know, like, I don't get any people don't like me for talking about these other views, but I know everyone just is tired, right? We're all tired of this market, and we all think just want it to break one way or the other. But there does exist a scenario where it just keeps on bouncing around in here until the unemployment rate gives us the all clear, right? And is starting to really trend or top out and trend back down. It could stay in this zone until that happens. So seasonality certainly favors Bitcoin going up. The next major resistance level is going to be right here. And it doesn't have to go right there. I mean, it might take it a couple of weeks to really get back up there by the end of the month, right? Get up there by the end of the month, hang out, wait for the unemployment rate to come in, and then decision time. And if the unemployment rate comes in hot, what it means is that the 3-month yield is going to go down a lot, right? It's at 4.641 now, and the 10-year is at 4.126. They're only about 50 basis points apart right now. And so if the unemployment rate comes in hot, and then all of a sudden the Fed has to cut more than what the market thinks, then that could lead to your uninversion of the 3-month and the 10-year yield, right? And that could be sort of the reason why Ethereum could finally get that last drop in December. You see what I'm saying? The same thing that happened in 2016. And why am I? It's a Bitcoin video. We'll talk about Ethereum in another video. But that's where I am right now. I mean, I'm still in favor of the seasonality, but I think the next big question mark is just where does the unemployment rate come in November, and that will dictate what Bitcoin does. And by the way, in the short term, the reason why I have those views is because, look, in the short term, Bitcoin has held the bull market support band. So that's got to at least give some, I mean, it's been giving some renewed interest to Bitcoin, right? This has been a pretty good week so far. And as I've said previously, normally once you get into mid-October, it tends to be bullish. Look, I mean, this is October 14th, Bitcoin's going up. Look at last year, October 16th, right? Bitcoin went up the week of October 16th. Look at the year before that, even in 2022, Bitcoin went up in late October. Look at 2021, right? Bitcoin was going up here. Look at 2020, October, Bitcoin was going up. Look at 2019, even there, it was a lower high. Bitcoin went up. You see that? It went up in late October. So that's why for the last couple of weeks I've said, look, late October could favor Bitcoin rallying back up to 66K, 68, 69. It could even go to 70, right? But the point is this is going to be the resistance level that Bitcoin has to break through for it to really mean something. Because until that happens, it still is just another lower high. And I think that if there is another drop, I think a lot of people sort of were comparing this wick in August to this wick here. But I really would push back against that and say, not really. I mean, how can you look at this chart and say that that is the same as this? But what's interesting about this is on the weekly time frame, your landing was at weekly close at that trend line, right? At 9 months later. And it broke through the lower high structure too, right? But that ended up being about 9 months later, right? That was 38 weeks, right? So 9 times 4 is 36, but there's a little bit more than 4 weeks in a month. So it was 9 months later for that final test of that trend line. And so if you look at something similar from that top, it's currently been 31 weeks. 38 weeks would put you the week of December 2nd, right around there. And the funny thing is ETH in 2016 bottomed the week of December 5th, which this time should correspond to the uninversion of the 3-month and the 10-year yield. It's kind of interesting how it's all coming together, right? How some of that stuff seems to be playing out, and it's a long, grueling process. And I think a lot of people are just tired, and every time it rallies, everyone gets excited, and every time it dumps, everyone gets depressed. But this is what I was sort of worried about earlier this year, was what happens if the market just kind of chops around and washes people out, And I think out of everyone's, again here, all systems go and ready for it to break out. Let's hope that happens, right? Let's hope for the best. Let's hope that it just breaks out so we don't have to worry about this anymore, and we can put it behind us. We can put this range behind us. Hope for the best, but plan for the worst, right? And as far as I know, I mean, the worst case scenario for the end of the year would just be dropping back down one more time over here, sending ETH home, and then maybe going up in 2025 if history repeats itself. But that's where we are right now, guys. Let's see what happens with Bitcoin in the short term. If I will say this, if it can get above here and then hold it as support, then we're probably moving higher in November, December. I think the issue is that we still have that ahead of us, and every single time it got rejected previously was when the labor market data came in. Right? Here, and there. So let's see. Can it break through or not? We should know within the next 2 to 3 weeks. Because I guess 2 weeks from now, it'll be the week where the unemployment rate comes out. So yeah, about 2.5 weeks from now, we should know, right? I mean, the unemployment rate's going to either, be good or bad, right? And I think we'll know then. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and again, check out Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. We put out a lot of videos like this. They go even more in depth on Into the Cryptoverse Premium, and also put out a lot of Telegram posts on there as well, talking about a lot of other markets too, and we go through a lot of other things besides just Bitcoin. Actually, one of the things I was looking at recently was some of these individual stocks like Meta. Meta was something that I was very avid about, that it was a great buy below $100 on ITC Premium, and I'm looking at it, I'm like, gosh, it's gone up way more than I thought it was going to. And this was sort of an obvious buy, as I said back then, but now I'm like, gosh, it's gone up 6x. How much higher can it go before it really starts to pull back? But it shows you that, when you get these major opportunities like this, sometimes it's good to just forget about it for a while, right? And not worry about what happens in the short term. So we'll see if that opportunity presents itself for some of these, some of these assets here, or some of the other assets that we've been following. But it is interesting how you can see some of these things play out, right? Major capitulations, buy, forget about it for a couple years, and now it's way up here. Far higher than I think a lot of people would have thought it would have been by this point. But nevertheless, there it is. If you guys like the content, again, subscribe, and I will see you next time. Bye.